Thousands of people trapped in towns and cities under siege. No food, no running water. Encircled by Russian forces under constant bombardment. This is Ukraine, 11 days after Russia invaded. Ukraine's president and its capital continue to resist, but Russia's Vladimir Putin shows no sign of backing down. Is there any hope of finding a way out, or is this conflict only going to get worse? Good morning. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is in its second week, and the crisis facing the country and the world is intensifying. We have the latest from Jeremy Bowen in the capital, Kyiv. I'll be joined by Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister. How long can her government and her country hold out? The man in charge of Britain's armed forces, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the Chief of the Defence Staff, is here with his first broadcast interview. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, will join me to talk about what more the West can and should do. For the government's view, the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, will join me live. And the Monty Python star and veteran traveller, Michael Palin, will be reflecting on events in Ukraine, a country he knows well. To see how the invasion is being covered by the papers here and the media in Russia, I'm joined by the Russia editor at BBC Monitoring, Vitaly Shevchenko, and by the Daily Telegraph's Madeline Grant. But first, the news with Ben Thompson.
Sophie, thank you. Ukrainians have been urged by their president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to drive the evil from their cities as Russians continue attempts to encircle the capital, Kyiv. It comes after a ceasefire in southern cities was cut short yesterday by ongoing shelling, leading to planned evacuations of Mariupol and Volnovakha being aborted. Local authorities in Mariupol say a new temporary ceasefire is now in place.
Ukrainians in all cities of Ukraine where the enemy has come into, you have to go on the offensive. It is necessary to fight if there is an opportunity.
Meanwhile, the payment firms Visa and MasterCard have announced they are disconnecting their services in Russia. Visa said in a statement that it would cut off transactions over the coming days, condemning what it called Russia's unprovoked invasion. Well, across Ukraine, the Russian military is keeping up its intense bombardments of towns. Irpin, northwest of Kyiv, has come under heavy fire. People talk there of constant shelling by the Russian military as it tries to break through and advance on the capital. But Ukrainian forces are continuing their resistance. They say this was a Russian helicopter that was brought down by one of their missiles close to the capital. Here in the UK, there has been more support for Ukraine from across the Premier League. Stands were turned blue and yellow for the nation, but Chelsea fans have been criticised for chanting their support of Russian owner Roman Abramovich. That is all the news for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Sophie, back to you.
Ben, thank you. 11 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the capital, Kyiv, remains in Ukrainian hands. That's despite the vast Russian military column that stretches 40 miles to the north, though it has made very little progress for days now. A short time ago, I spoke to the BBC's Jeremy Bowen, who is in Kyiv, and asked him what the atmosphere is like in the capital, with fighting now just about 10 miles away.
Well, I can hear, even as I stand talking to you, there's some distant thumps and crumps and roars, which are about, they're a good distance, as you said, away from the city centre. Here, where we are, in the centre of Kyiv, right in the centre, next to the holy sites of the Orthodox Church and with some, beautiful buildings around here, it has not been hit. It's a bit weird because the streets are empty, but the city, apart from the fact the shops aren't open in the main, looks normal. There is this mood of defiance and, I've been driving around chatting to people and there aren't really food queues. They seem to have plenty of that, but there are quite big queues outside pharmacies because not all of them are open and it's cold, and of course people need their medication if they require it, their prescriptions. And outside one, I met a young couple, Maxim and Alice, and they were remarkably defiant. You seem pretty relaxed.
Evil can win a battle, but it will never win the war. Never. Good always wins. So in the end, I see that we are united. I see that we have a huge support from Britain, from NATO. Don't fear Putin. Don't be afraid of him.
Don't be afraid of Putin. Why not?
Yeah, because he's very afraid himself right now.
And he went on to say that Putin is probably thinking he's surrounded by traitors and full of suspicions. You know, right here, it feels like a strange in-between period, because one of the big questions on people's minds is, will this center of the capital get attacked by the Russians? Now, I was in Grozny in Chechnya, one of the Russian republics, back in the mid-90s when the Russians attacked it, and they flattened it. And I've seen in Syria, in Aleppo and around Damascus and in other places in that country, just what the Russians are prepared to do if they want to. And I think it is very interesting that certainly up to this point, President Putin has left this place, so far, alone.
Jeremy Bowen in the capital, Kyiv. Thank you. Well, that was Jeremy talking to me a short time ago. Let's have a look at the front pages of this morning's papers, now dominated by images of people under siege. And this extraordinary image that is in a lot of papers this morning, this is Ukrainians fleeing the attacks on Kyiv. And they're waiting under a bridge, a wrecked bridge, to cross the river Irpin, which is northwest. It's about a 45-minute drive from the centre of Kyiv, northwest. And just all these thousands of people standing under that bridge trying to escape. Merciless Putin shells evacuees is the headline. And another extraordinary image on the front of the Sunday Mirror this morning. And this is in Kherson, which is the only city that Russia has managed to take. But these are unarmed civilians. We saw protests yesterday who are just facing down the Russian troops, even though they're firing into the air. The Observer's headline, Defiant Putin warns the West your sanctions are akin to an act of war. The Sunday Telegraph, don't test us. That's Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, telling President Putin. He says any existential threat will be met with a response as he considers extra money for weapons that halted Russian tanks. The Mail on Sunday, Boris's 6-point plan to defeat President Putin, and also news of the appeal at £3.6 million that has already been raised for refugees. We speak to Michael Palin later in the programme as well, and he has been helping with that appeal. And finally, a lot of coverage in the papers this morning too of the death of Shane Warne. Come on, Shane, and details in the Sun on Sunday about what happened, and his friends who were with him when he was found in a villa in Thailand. Well, with me now to review the papers is the Russia editor at BBC Monitoring, Vitaly Shevchenko, whose job it is to monitor all the news coming out of Russia day in, day out. And I'm also joined by the Telegraph columnist, Madeline Grant. Good morning to both of you. Vitaly, first of all, it's a very, very difficult time for you. Not only are you having to monitor all this from here, you are Ukrainian, you're a Russian-speaking Ukrainian from the east, and your family, your parents, are still in the city that we've seen a lot of this week where the nuclear power plant is. What is the latest news from them?
Yes, they are in Zaporizhia and things are looking very grim. Who can fight is preparing to fight. There's a massive defence effort going on. A classmate of mine spent 3 days trying to enlist in the Territorial Defence Force. And the reason why it's taking so long is because the queues are absolutely enormous. Thousands of people in Zaporizhia trying to join the fight. Women are making camouflage nets, Molotov cocktails. My father, who's 71, he's packing sand into bags to make roadblocks. So it's a massive effort. And it seems as though it's a matter of time before the Russians attack, and it's going to be very different from Kherson, which was captured earlier. OK, I'm
just going to break in here because we're going to speak right now, and we're going to come back to the papers, but we have here with us on the line Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Olha Stefanishyna, who is in Ukraine and joins us. Good morning, very, very good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Just tell us what the latest situation is for you.
Well, Thank you for being permanently active on this topic. For us, it's really important that despite of the fact that the war is not ending in 1 or 2 days, it is presumably be a long-lasting process. We understand that nobody should tolerate that. We see now that another wave of implementation of this terroristic plan of Russian Federation has started. Given the strong resistance our army showed, now the enormous pressure is done against civilian population, especially in those towns and cities and villages, which has been now under the control of Russian Federation. The murdering and many things are happening around physical pressure to the citizens. Some of them are being killed. This is what we see. We have more than 2,000 of civilians who has already been affected from direct military attacks from the air, but also through the land military techniques right in the cities of Ukraine, the shelled hospitals, the shelled houses for kindergartens and school, and the ordinary households. This is how the reality looks, but it seems like it does not look like the agenda for the new wave of sanctions to be introduced by the democratic world, Europe, and different groups. We're working with our partners, but situation is going more and more severe. We understand that it's not not the end of the war, even especially given our determination and the enormous losses Russian army faces, both in human dimension in terms of soldiers, but also in terms of techniques, is something that does not deter Russia, but only encourage the further aggression.
Can I ask?
And it is also confirmed by intelligence around the world.
Can I ask you about Mariupol? There's very, very little information coming out of there, but we know the citizens there are under very heavy attack. A ceasefire, we understand, is going or is in place right now for the whole day. How much confidence do you have that that will hold, that those people will be able to get out?
I will start by saying that this complicated situation is in many other cities of Ukraine in different parts, like Sumy, Kherson, and Volnovakha, and many other cities around Ukraine, which has been captured by Russian terroristic groups and Russian army. But indeed, Mariupol has been identified as the first point where we will test the agreement which has been reached bilaterally and also supported by the Red Cross organization on establishing the humanitarian corridor, both for providing humanitarian aid to population in the affected regions, but also voluntary evacuation of people. The first wave of this evacuation should have started yesterday. But we basically didn't start it because of the shelling, which was ongoing throughout the territory agreed as a humanitarian corridor, first in Mariupol and then in Volnovakha. And today, hopefully, this agreement will be implemented. We do not do any single step without informing the International Organization of Red Cross and obliging Red Cross to have the confirmation of the agreement from both sides, from Ukrainian and Russian. We see that the International Red Cross organization can do much more, but they still feel reluctant, not understanding that the war is happening right in the center of Europe. So we requested the facilitation and maybe observance of this bilateral dialogue to avoid losing time while people are suffering. So we hope that the ICRC will play a better role in that regard. But hopefully today we will manage to make the evacuation based on the agreement reached bilaterally between officials both on Ukrainian and Russian side.
And what about your safety? You and the government, you're the Deputy Prime Minister. What about President Zelensky? Are there armed Russian units trying to assassinate President Zelensky? Do you have information on that?
It's really important that when you're talking to Ukrainian citizens, and especially Ukrainian politicians, know Russian playbooks by heart. So whenever it comes to Mariupol or the question you're putting, it is very clear to understand that they have the ordinary playbook. We never trust what they say, even if it is agreed. And of course, we know that there is a willingness to identify the areas when the government is functioning together or individually. And especially it becomes more important for the Russian administration, because since the first day of war, the government has been fully operational. So we have been fulfilling all our obligations, both social payments, budgetary payments, internal and external financial expenditures, implementation of the economic programs in the military times, supporting population, redirecting resources directly to support people. So, and each of our ministers is working on this direction to condemn the Russian aggression and to make sure that the whole world knows that the price does everything, that the price for any war in a territory of a democratic state in the 21st century shall has its price. So knowing that the government is fully operational, it becomes even more important for Russian and Kremlin.
The West has said that they cannot provide it will not impose a no-fly zone. Do you feel abandoned by the West when you hear them say that? Because we've heard President Zelensky ask for one over and over.
Well, my president was as precise as it is possible, and we absolutely support from the bottom of our hearts everything he says, because this is what we feel. And it is very upsetting when a group of 30 leaders or ministers or even ambassadors are of 30 states gathering itself in a fancy cabinet with a fancy garniture and talking about the fancy thing, knowing that Ukraine was over this table for all of this year, sitting in these fancy offices, but now knowing that we can't be there because we are operating under the bombarding of Russian Federation, and knowing that it is very, and knowing that their intelligence also confirms that further severe attacks on the civil population, including carpet bombarding of the cities, which are basically happening these days already in some cities, will be taking place, and thousands of new civilian victims will be in Ukraine. Having clarity in that, these 30 leaders are thinking on the consequences of what would happen if they will do this, but they're not thinking of what wouldn't happen if they would do this. So
I can see you there.
We are very upset, and
apologies. I can see you there. I can see you there with the sandbags behind you. Is this a war that Ukraine can win? And can I ask you, are you prepared to fight?
We are fighting for the 8th year in a row. Our army is strong as it has never been, and basically only for these less than 10 years of war, Russia has faced more losses than jointly for the 10 years of war in Afghanistan and Syria. So this is the answer to your question. But what you have to know about Ukrainians is the nation, whether it's a battlefield or any other front. So speaking about the no-fly zone, we continue our efforts on the UN platform. We have identified strategy, and we know that we have a lot of support among our partners from other countries. And I'm sure that this day or the other day, this decision will be taken. But hope that it will not be taken too late. And
Olha, I'm sorry, the line is cutting in and out. It is very, very good to see you there. And thank you so much for talking to us, taking the time to talk to us this morning. Olha Stefanishyna, thank you. Well, that is live from Ukraine, the Deputy Prime Minister there. And extraordinary to see her there talking like that in the midst of all this.
It really sums it up, doesn't it? The Deputy Prime Minister sitting there surrounded by sandbags with the Ukrainian flag flying proudly beside her. I just think it sums up the situation perfectly, and being so strong and stoical about what is a terrifying and harrowing situation for everyone there.
And a real determination, as we have spoken about before, but a real determination on behalf of Ukraine to fight on despite everything.
That's one of the most striking things for me, because we're talking about Russian-speaking part of Ukraine that's being captured right now. That's where they made the most progress. And talking to my friends and family and seeing social media footage coming out of that part of Ukraine, it's abundantly clear that the locals are doing all they can to show to the Russians that they're not welcome. They're trying to literally stop Russian tanks with their bare hands and chanting glory to Ukraine. These are the people Putin claims to be liberating.
Let's look at some of the papers we started on already, but this one here, which is in the Sun, it is an amazing image, isn't it? There's over a lot of the papers. This is another angle of it, but this is this bridge in Irpin, which is northwest of Kyiv, not very far now from the centre.
Yes, we've seen those pictures, similar pictures from all over Ukraine, civilian infrastructure being bombed, destroyed, people being evacuated from places like Sumy, where utility companies have been targeted, and it's a cold time of the year in Ukraine still. It can go down below freezing point, and if you have no heating, no electricity, it's a dire situation.
And Madeline, let's look at this one in the Observer. Life in Fortress Kyiv. If we hear someone is not reliable, they get a task without weapons, is the headline there.
It's amazing reporting from Sean Walker in The Guardian. He's talking about how what really strikes me from reading this story is simply that it feels that this grim reality for Ukraine, it feels like it's been going on forever, and certainly if you're in Ukraine it must feel like, you know, the ghastly new normal. But less than a fortnight ago, a city like Kyiv was a bustling city of 3 million inhabitants, and now it's descended into a total war zone. And he describes how the volunteer forces have been making makeshift sites at which they're trying to defend, and how they've been triaging some of the volunteers to work out who should be doing what, who should be tasked with a gun and guarding facilities, and who should be doing perhaps more kind of transporting and I guess more menial jobs, and how very quickly overnight a city that was utterly normal and normal life was continuing has descended into this new reality.
I think some of the really striking images this week, Vitaly, have been of the young men, the teenagers, almost children, who are literally signing up, taking arms, 3 days training, going to the front.
It's an all-out effort, and it's the speed with which it's all happening that's also posing a major humanitarian problem, because within a matter of a couple of weeks we went from Russia denying that it was going to attack Ukraine to actually doing it, and Ukrainians had literally no time to prepare. And if we look at what refugees are trying to do, they're facing enormous difficulties in trying to leave the cities that I think are going to be bombed by the Russians very soon. And
Madeline, let's talk about what the West is doing in response to this story here about sanctions. You were going to talk about that one.
Yes, absolutely. This is a fantastic report in the Times by Robert Watts, who is the compiler of their rich list. And he describes how the extent to which cash-hungry politicians have helped turn London into Moscow-on-Thames, a playground of the rich who are able to launder their wealth and enjoy the kind of soft power and the cultural pleasures and the fancy restaurants and the luxuries that are so appealing to the oligarchs. And it is a fascinating piece, but I do wonder, though, alongside all of this, that given how much those described in this article here, how much they owe their survival, Putin being their protector, how quick they would be to actually reject him, despite the fact that being denied access to Western luxuries and having harsh economic sanctions and potentially having property requisitioned and so on, ultimately they owe their survival to Putin. And without his survival, they will lose their remaining Russian assets. So I do also wonder just how hard this would go and the impact it would have.
We've seen lots of the yachts that have been seized. There are houses, huge, £100 million houses. You do wonder what actually happens though when they've got them. What do they do? Sell them?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're sort of in pretty new territory, aren't we? This has all happened in a matter of days. But there seems to have been real difficulty with some of these requisitions. I mean, I think some of them have been reported, and in fact, it's turned out that it wasn't as easy as they thought to requisition things like yachts, and that things were owned by offshore companies that were hard to trace back to the individuals concerned. So it's not as easy as it sounds, even though the idea may be so incredibly appealing to people in the West, the idea of finally reclaiming some of these properties, and the idea of possibly even taking the proceeds and somehow giving them to Ukraine.
And then on the front page of the Sunday Times as well, the PM's Russian crony, it says, got a peerage after spies dropped warning. This is Lebedeva
Yes, that's right. Well, I think the PM's friendship with Lebedev, the Moscow-born son of an ex-KGB agent and the former editor of the Evening Standard, has been well known about for some time. But the really explosive allegation here in the Sunday Times is the fact that they report that the Prime Minister, in fact, put pressure onto the security services to kind of water down their warning about the possible dangers of giving this man a peerage in order that he could proceed. And that is what they're claiming, and that, I think, is the real explosive allegation in this story.
Vitaly, your job at the BBC in monitoring is to listen day in, day out to what is being said in Russia. And I've spoken to you about it before. It is an extraordinarily different picture. Let's just watch a clip, first of all. This is Russian television. You're going to tell us what we're seeing.
Last night, our military prevented a man-made disaster on a truly global scale. The Ukrainian armed forces and the local so-called territorial defence decided to play a silly war game right next to a nuclear reactor. As a result, a battle broke out at Europe's largest nuclear power station, and then a fire started. It was only thanks to the truly heroic actions by our military that the Ukrainian military were kicked out and firefighters could access the site.
So that is what Russians are being told, and they don't have any other source, really, of getting any other information.
It's a very good example of how words can kill. What we're seeing on Russian TV is a topsy-turvy world of parallel reality. They are blaming Ukraine for everything. Ukraine is the aggressor. It's run by neo-Nazis who are bent on exterminating the Russian-speaking part of the population. None of that is true. As for what Russians can actually see, the independent part of the Russian media has been obliterated over a period of less than 1 week, actually. Independent websites either gone or are now saying, well, we have to play by the Kremlin's rules, otherwise our staff will face jail sentences of up to 15 years in jail. But Russians can still see and hear what's happening in Ukraine if they have access to social media, even though the government has been trying to block access to Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. If you know anything about computers, and if you know about things like virtual private networks, which are tools that circumvent blocks, they still can access reports coming from Ukraine. So they are, well, some of them, especially the younger parts of the public in Russia, they are aware of the atrocities happening in Ukraine. And we've seen sizable protests happening in Russia every evening since the war started. And it takes extraordinary courage to protest against the war in Russia because, well, you're not allowed to call it a war, you're risking incarceration, and still Russians are brave enough, some of them are brave enough to protest.
Vitaly, thank you very much for joining us, and Madeline Grant as well. And Vitaly, I hope your parents remain safe. Let's have a look at the weather now with Matt Taylor. Hello, Matt.
Good morning, Sophie. Good morning, all. Bright start once again across the northern half of the country. Beautiful here in Edinburgh behind me, but it is cold. Temperatures still below freezing across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland right now. But the blue skies will continue throughout the day. More cloud, though, towards parts of England and Wales, especially further south you are, bringing the odd very isolated shower. Most places, though, will be dry, and that cloud is more well broken than it was yesterday, so a better chance of sunshine through eastern areas. A keen breeze, though, blowing across the south. That is going to make it feel rather chilly. Further north, especially into parts of far north of England and Scotland, lighter winds here, and even though it's cold at the moment, very pleasant this afternoon. Temperatures up to around 10 or 11 degrees at the highest, but they will drop away quite quickly once the sun sets tonight. A cloud will come and go across southern areas, so temperatures will fluctuate here, but the overall story is of a widespread frost into tomorrow morning. Greater chance certainly in southern areas compared with the past few days. -5 to -7 again across some northern parts of the country, but it leads us into a lovely start to Monday. Crisp, fresh and bright. Differences tomorrow, though. More of a breeze across some western parts of the country. Cloud in the south will drift its way northward, so for some of you, a little bit more cloud than you've seen through this weekend. For others, a bit more sunshine. A cool day, but it will turn milder as we go through this week, with some sunshine at times to begin with, but turning cloudy from the west with some rain, and it will be quite windy. That's how it's looking. Sophie.
Matt, thank you. So can Ukraine continue to resist the Russian invasion, and for how long? And what, if anything, can the West do to bring the conflict to an end? A short while ago, I spoke to the man in charge of the UK's armed forces, the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, who took up his new post at the end of last year. I began by asking if it is inevitable that Russia takes over the whole of Ukraine.
No, I think we've seen a Russian invasion that is not going well. I think we're also seeing a remarkable resistance by Ukraine, both its armed forces and its people. And we're also seeing the unity of the whole globe coming together with a cohesive approach, whether that's economically, diplomatically, culturally, socially, militarily, applying pressure to Russia, and that needs to continue so that Russia stops this invasion.
But President Putin says, he told the French President, President Macron, that he will continue until he achieves the neutralisation and disarmament of Ukraine. Does that change anything about the decision by the West not to get involved?
No, I think that if anything, it means that the West and the whole globe has to increase its resolve. It's doing the right thing by a unified approach. It's doing the right thing by a cohesive approach, but we all have to acknowledge that we're likely to see Russia ratcheting up the violence. We're going to see more indiscriminate shelling. We're going to see more ridiculous violence, such as that was meted out on the Ukraine population or attacking nuclear power plants. And the world has to maintain the resolve to keep applying its pressure on Russia, because it's Putin who can bring this to an end.
But that means standing back and watching Russia continue to shell towns and cities. Thousands of people we have seen trapped in those places. Can the West really continue to just watch on?
So this is a really difficult situation. It's a desperate and awful situation for the people of Ukraine. But we also have to be sensible in acknowledging that we want to avoid a war with Russia. And that would lead to a terrible situation getting even worse. The last thing that we want is a war between NATO and Russia and increased escalation.
What is to say, though, that if President Putin takes Ukraine, he will stop there?
I think we should acknowledge that NATO is this extraordinary, strong military force. 3.5 million people under arms, the most powerful military force in the world. And NATO has strengthened its borders on the eastern flank. The world has been incredibly clear about the repercussions that are being borne by Russia now. And this invasion is not going well for Russia. Russia is suffering. Russia is an isolated power. It's less powerful than it was 10 days ago. And the Russia cannot continue. So we have to have the confidence that what we're doing is the right thing.
But in the meantime, a lot of people are dying, civilians are dying. President Zelensky says everyone who dies will die because of NATO as well, because of NATO's weakness, because of NATO's disunity. Do you feel that the West is letting President Zelensky and his country down?
People are dying in Ukraine because of Russia and President Putin's invasion. And the UK was one of the first countries to recognise Ukraine's independence in 1991. In 2015, we started Operation Orbital, which is military, predominantly in the maritime and land domain, support to Ukraine. We were the first in Europe to start supplying lethal aid to Ukraine. We've strengthened, as part of NATO, our pressure on Russia so that we protect NATO and we ensure that Russia knows that we're ready if Russia was to try and expand this conflict any further. And we owe it to the people of Ukraine to continue that support, but we also owe it to the people of Ukraine and the whole of Europe and the world to ensure that this does not escalate.
And you say that you think that the people of Ukraine could win this, but is this a war that will last a long time, that could last a decade?
So I think we've seen already the unpredictable nature of war, and I don't want to predict when this will come to an end. This is going to be bloody, it's going to lead to more death and destruction, and it's Putin that has to stop it. But in terms of whether or not Russia is going to be successful as an occupying force and the carnage that will be meted out back to Russia and the inability of Russia to hold Ukraine, that's what it's going to suffer. And you're seeing that with this incredible resistance, with the incredible resolve of both the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people.
We've seen images over the last few days of this extraordinary convoy, satellite images, 40 miles long, this convoy. And there are pictures there. It's north of Kyiv. And yet it seems to have stalled. Is that because of logistical problems? Is that because of low morale? How much do we really know about what is going on there?
So we don't have a complete picture, but we do know about a series of factors. So one is Russia hasn't operated at this scale since the Second World War. And to do what's called combined arms manoeuvre is incredibly complex and incredibly difficult. And we're seeing Russia failing to do that in a competent fashion. So they were held up north of Kyiv, and their forces started to become dislocated. Then you've seen the failure of Russia with just some basics in terms of the maintenance of its kit, and their kit has been failing. And then at the same time, Russia has been attacked by Ukrainian armed forces, and then their rear echelon, some of their logistics have been attacked. And now you're seeing that whole convoy stuck. It continues to be attacked, and that is impacting on morale. There are stories of the troops in those vehicles. They don't want to stay in those vehicles, so they're camping out in the forest. They're stuck there, and Russia has got itself into a mess, not just with that convoy, but in the whole of Ukraine, and we need to keep applying the pressure on Russia.
But those stories of morale, you call them stories. Do we know that that is true or not?
We absolutely do. So we know that there are some of the battalion tactical groups, those that have been leading the fight for Russia, have suffered terrible losses. We know that Russia acknowledges it's lost nearly 500 people. To put that into context, that's nearly 500 soldiers in 1 week, and that is more than the UK lost in Afghanistan over 20 years. Ukraine claims nearly 10,000 casualties. We don't know if that is true, but we do know that some of the lead elements of Russian forces have been decimated by the Ukrainian response.
How worried are you that President Putin could use nuclear weapons?
So I think we've got to be very cautious about President Putin's threats. We are part of the world's largest military alliance. We have our own nuclear deterrent. We've got to maintain a calmness and responsibility so that we don't just react rashly to whatever is the latest, frankly at times, bizarre or ridiculous comment from President Putin. So we are prepared, we are professional armed forces, we will approach this conflict with that level of professionalism and responsibility that you would expect. And we will also be incredibly confident in our ability to face down President Putin.
Would we know if the Russians were preparing to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Could they do it without us knowing beforehand?
So I don't want to go into the detail, but if you look at this conflict, we've had a remarkable level of intelligence, and we were saying for months that this is what President Putin was intending to do. And there are some more discrete elements in terms of warning signs if this was going to start to chart a path towards nuclear escalation.
And what about these nuclear plants? We've already seen one, the biggest in Europe, being shelled this week. What is the risk of the others? There are 3 more in Ukraine. What is the risk of those being attacked?
So I think there is a real risk because Russia is struggling with its objectives on the ground in Ukraine. And we've seen from Russia's previous actions in Syria and in Chechnya, where it will turn up the violence, it will lead to more indiscriminate killing and more indiscriminate destruction. And we have to keep applying the pressure to Russia that this is outrageous, and that the sense that because your invasion isn't going very well, that you just become more and more reckless in applying violence is totally unacceptable. And it's especially unacceptable when you start attacking nuclear plants.
The Ukrainians keep calling for a no-fly zone. The West has made it very clear that that is not going to happen. The Ukrainians want fighter planes to be provided. Why do we not provide fighter planes when we do provide anti-tank missiles?
So I think there is a difference with the anti-tank weapons are obviously very defensive. the weapons that we provided have got a range of about 500 metres. So you've got to drive your tank several hundred kilometres before you're within the range of that anti-tank weapon. I think the no-fly zone, we have to be very careful, and the advice that we as senior military professionals are giving our politicians is to avoid doing things that are tactically ineffective, and definitely to avoid doing things that tactically might lead to miscalculation or escalation. The no-fly zone would not help. Most of the shelling is coming from artillery. Most of the destruction is coming from artillery. It's not coming from Russian aircraft. And then if we were to police a no-fly zone, it means that we'd probably have to take out Russian defence systems, and we would have NATO aircraft in the air alongside Russian aircraft, and then the potential of shooting them down, and then that leads to an escalation.
Last week I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, and she told me that she would back people from Britain going out to Ukraine to fight. Are you worried that reservists or even current soldiers might try and join in independently, as it were? We're
part of a professional armed forces, and our people, if they want to serve their country, if they want to do the right thing, then they continue serving in their own armed forces. And we've been very clear that it's unlawful as well as unhelpful for UK military and for the UK population to start going towards Ukraine in that sense. Support from the UK, support in whatever way you can. But this isn't really something that you want to rush to in terms of the sound of gunfire. This is about sensible support based in the UK.
So the Foreign Secretary should not have been suggesting that people go from Britain to Ukraine to fight?
I think she was reflecting, that we can all understand that sentiment, and that sentiment needs to be channeled into support for Ukraine. But we're saying, as professional military people, that actually that is not necessarily the sensible thing to be doing.
What about President Zelensky himself? We see him almost daily now in Ukraine. Do you have any information that armed units are in Ukraine, Russian units trying to assassinate him?
So I think when we see President Zelensky, all of us just are full of admiration for his leadership and the way that he is leading his armed forces and the way that he's leading his country. And it's not surprising that he then becomes a target for Russia. But I don't want to go into the detail of some of the things that we're seeing and how we're monitoring Russian behaviour.
You have spoken to the head of the Russian Army General Gerasimov. Do you have insight into what he is thinking?
So I spoke with General Gerasimov in December. I accompanied the Defence Secretary a couple of weeks ago to Moscow to meet him as well. And we had very frank conversations. So some of that was military to military, and to acknowledge the risk of miscalculation and the importance of us being able to speak to each other. And then the other part, we also said that we would keep our conversations private, but I can assure you that the conversation that we had was frank, and it was very clear in terms of saying that we were aware of Russia's plans to invade Ukraine, that we thought this would be a tragic mistake for both Russia and Ukraine, and that it would be a catastrophic mistake for Russia. Now, I don't understand the logicality of Russia's actions. When they talk about being fearful of NATO, both myself and the Defence Secretary were incredibly clear that this would lead to a strengthened NATO. This would lead to a more unified NATO, and that's what we're seeing.
Is there still an open line between you and the Russian army? Is there still some way to communicate, to de-escalate if needs be?
So we have a line in the Ministry of Defence that goes direct to the Moscow operational headquarters. That's tested every day. We've used that line for me to say to General Gerasimov that we need to speak, and I'm waiting for him to come back to me. And other countries also have direct lines in, but these lines of communication are not as strong as we would want them to be, and that's why we're furthering them as best as we can.
Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Labour Party has been calling for tougher sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine, but like the government, it says that military intervention, including a no-fly zone, must be ruled out because it would mean war between NATO and Russia. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, joins me now. Good morning. Is there a red line beyond which we would just have to intervene?
Well, I think everybody understands why there can't be a military intervention because of the escalation that would inevitably follow from that. It does mean that the other measures, the sanctions and other measures, have to be the strongest that are possible across the world, including here in the United Kingdom. It's among the reasons we're pushing the government so hard on sanctions, because the sanctions have to do a lot of work here. They have to not just isolate Russia, they have to make it impossible for Russia to function. And so we've got a big bill, a piece of legislation going through Parliament tomorrow. We want to push the government further and faster than they're going on sanctions, because they have to do so much work in this conflict.
You say that everybody understands why a no-fly zone is not being imposed. President Zelensky doesn't, and he's called for that repeatedly. But is there a point at which we can no longer stand back and watch? If President Putin just keeps shelling cities for days, weeks, if people keep dying?
Well, NATO has been very clear as an alliance on this, that getting drawn into a war between NATO and Russia, the escalation, would benefit nobody. It would be a very, very risky situation that nobody wants to see. And that's why what you've seen in the last 10 days is this incredible unity. Putin wants to see division. He wants to see Ukraine's allies divided. He wants to see NATO divided. He wants to see a division between the political parties here in the United Kingdom. And that's why we as the Labour Party, as the opposition, on the principle of standing up for Ukraine against Russian aggression, we stand as one in the United Kingdom on that issue. Our aim is to push the government further on sanctions. We've got the opportunity tomorrow, and if sanctions are going to work, it's very important that we know who owns what property here in the United Kingdom. And we've been saying to the government for some time, you therefore need a register. The government now accepts that. The government initially said, well, we'll give people 18 months to register. That's far, far too long, because people will simply sell their homes and their assets if they think they're going to be seized. The government's retreated because of our argument and said, well, 6 months. But 6 months is still more than enough time to sell property here in the United Kingdom. So tomorrow we want to push them further to say reduce that down to 28 days, make it a really effective sanction so that we can put maximum pressure on Russia. And I hope, we've been working in the sense of unity. We are challenging the government hard tomorrow. I want them to hear this today. They've got their own MPs who agree with us, and I want the government to say, actually, on reflection, we do need to go further. Let's reduce that time down to 28 days and make it a situation where anybody who's got property here that should be subject to sanctions is registered, and those sanctions can really, really buy it.
Do you accept, though, that the government is doing or is making progress on oligarchs?
Yes. But I am frustrated because many people, including the Labour Party, have been calling for these measures for a long time. There was a report called the Russia Report in 2020, 2 years ago now, that set out in detail what the problems were with Russian money in the United Kingdom, amongst other influences, political influence. The government's done nothing about that report. It's just sat there. The economic crime bill, the bill that we will be discussing tomorrow, and will pass through tomorrow because we will support it, that's a bill that's been talked about for a number of years, and it was in the Queen's speech last year that it would come through, and here we are. There's sort of I suppose the frustration is this: there's echoes of Afghanistan, which is a government that really only begins to get its act together and respond in the heat of the situation rather than preparing for it beforehand. So, but we will support them tomorrow. Our votes will be there for these sanctions, and we will stand united. But are we frustrated that they're going slowly, and they didn't look at this months ago? But these sanctions could actually be in place by now if the government had a bit of forethought on this. But as I say, I don't want to divide other than to push the government further and faster on this.
Can I ask you about the story? There's a story in the Sunday Times this morning, and we know how entangled Russian money is in Britain. And there's a story about the Russian businessman Evgeny Lebedev, who owns the Evening Standard, he owns the Independent, and his peerage. We're going to ask the government about it, but the government says that his peerage, it was all vetted, everybody who gets those, it's all on merit.
Well, I'm very concerned about that story because it goes to the heart of national security, and there's at least the suggestion that the government and the Prime Minister were warned that there was a national security risk in this particular appointment. I think in the circumstances, what the appropriate thing is for the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is a cross-party committee in Parliament that can have access to confidential material. I think this case should be referred to that committee so they can look into this story, this allegation, which is very serious because, of course, it's a matter of national security. I hope the government will answer it today, obviously in relation to any questions that are put to the government, but I think the right thing to do is to refer it to the committee, cross-party committee, that can look at the confidential material and come to a view on what actually happened and the risk that the government may or may not have taken.
But just to be clear, do you have any evidence? Or what evidence do you have that this should be looked at in greater detail?
All I've seen is what's being reported in the media, and that's why, rather than form my own view on it, I think the right thing to do is to refer it to the Intelligence and Security Committee, because there will be, we've got a fiercely free and independent press which will look into this, quite right too. But there needs to be a process, and I think that the best thing is if it goes to the committee, because then they can look at the confidential material as well and form a view on it.
The landscape has changed incredibly quickly, hasn't it? Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, told me last week that Britain needs to spend more on defence. You said that we need to spend more on defence. How much more would you spend, and how are you going to pay for it?
Well, I think there does need to be a step back and review of defence policy, because this has, I think, blown away some of the assumptions that the government was working on. So that exercise needs to be gone through. We've been critical of the government for cutting back, they're cutting back, our army by another 10,000 soldiers. They're wrong to do that, and we've said we wouldn't have done that. But I think on the government benches, there's a growing sense that there's got to be a review by the government of its defence policy, its strategy and its funding, and I think that's true.
But what would you do? I mean, the government has already spent 40 billion last year on defence. It's added a further 16.5 billion to that over the next 4 years. How much more would you spend?
Well, we've said we wouldn't be making the cuts that the government is currently making, but I think in the middle of a conflict, we have to focus on the job in hand, which is supporting Ukraine and ensuring that Putin is defeated. But in the aftermath, of course, there's going to have to be a review across Parliament about spending and about priorities and about strategy in relation to defence.
And as I say, the landscape has changed enormously just in the space of a few short weeks. Until very recently, you were calling for the Prime Minister to resign. Do you now withdraw that call for him to resign immediately?
I do think there's a basic question of trust, and it does seem a long time ago now we were talking about all of the allegations that the Prime Minister faces. He, of course, is still being investigated by the Metropolitan Police. I do think there's an issue of trust, but I'm very clear as the leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party, that when it comes to standing up to Russian aggression and standing in support of Ukraine, it's very important in the United Kingdom and in our politics that we show the world that we're united, and therefore whatever other challenges and frustrations and criticism I have of the Prime Minister, and I've got many, on this issue, there is unity, and it's very important that we demonstrate that unity. And there was a fantastic moment in Parliament on Wednesday last week when the Ukrainian ambassador came to Parliament, and every single person spontaneously turned to him and clapped, and that was an incredible moment. But it reflected something that's very real, which is this unity across Parliament. So, yes, I have my criticism. Those challenges are not going to go away. But when it comes to standing up to Russian aggression, we stand as one.
Which means you withdraw your call for him to resign immediately?
Well, look, at the moment, the Prime Minister is obviously concentrating on the job in hand, and we stand united as the United Kingdom on that issue.
Sir Keir Starmer, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, 30 years ago, the broadcaster, comedian and Monty Python star Sir Michael Palin travelled from the North Pole to the South Pole for the BBC. It was 1991, and he crossed what was then the Soviet Union and travelled through Ukraine by train. 15 years later, he returned. Ukraine by then was an independent nation. I've been talking to him about his memories of the country and his reflections on the crisis now.
Well, of course, when we went in 1991, it was part of the Soviet Union. And we went through Kyiv, we went right down to Odessa on our way south to the South Pole. Met this very interesting guy, Vadim, who was a Ukrainian nationalist. And at the time, he talked to me and he said, Ukraine will be independent one day. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not in my own lifetime, maybe in my children's lifetime. But Ukraine will be independent. He was very forceful about that.
I see Ukrainian history being revived. I see Ukrainian culture, you know, the culture which many people thought...
And the extraordinary thing was that within 4 months, the Soviet Union had collapsed and Ukraine had its independence. So that, the speed with which it happened, I think, is extraordinary, and also part of the problem now, I think.
When you went back in 2006 to film another series, The New Europe,
yeah,
everything had changed. You met Vadim again.
Yes.
Vadim, you know, the eyes of the world.
What had changed was that, you know, the idea that Ukraine sprang freshly formed in 1991 from the end of the Soviet Union hadn't happened. And Ukraine was having its own power struggles. There were differences between the conservative elements, slightly pro-Russian, and the Western European-leaning elements.
It's fascinating watching the footage from your films back, and, for example, Independence Square, which we all see day in, day out now.
Yes.
Our correspondents, our reporters out there, totally deserted. In your film, packed with people. What are your recollections of Kyiv when you were there?
Well, Independence Square was where it all happened, and when we were there, especially the second time, there was a great deal of political activity there. There were people sort of taking over parts of the square to put their point of view. Flags were going up. It was a terrific a sort of forum for debate and discussion and ideas about what was going to happen to Ukraine.
When you went back in 2006, you visited Crimea, which was very much a sort of seaside resort, extraordinary images of people out there basking in the sunshine. And even then, though, this is pre-annexation, pre the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia. But even then, you really did feel the tension, didn't you, between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, we did. And we talked to a woman there who said that she still felt very much part of Russia. And again, I think that conservative sort of group of people who really felt that they'd lost something without the protection of Russia. And of course, Crimea is closer to the Russian border, it's to the east. Going to the west of Ukraine, you wouldn't have heard that at all, really.
What are your thoughts about President Zelensky? Because we know he was, before this, he was a comedian. And an entertainer, a great fan of Monty Python.
Well, I didn't know he's a great fan of Monty Python, so we can't claim credit there. I think he's amazing. I think the thing is about comedians, people tend to think they just make people laugh. In order to make people laugh and understand what they're laughing at, you've got to know about what's going on. You've got to have your ear to the ground. You've got to know what people are talking about, how people are feeling. It's a very, very fine line. And also you've got to know about the tragedy as well as the comedy. So I think good comedians have great insight. And I think that was the case with Zelensky. And he has been quite brilliant, I think. Not only very brave in staying in the country when people were saying, we'll take you out somewhere safe. He decided to stay. And he has played Putin very, very well. He is the other side of Putin. Putin is aloof, disdainful, uncommunicative. Zelensky is quite the opposite. He talks to people in Russian, he talks to people in English, he's always on air. I mean, he's again, I'm going back to this young versus old. He is the sort of face, I think, of change, of the new sort of younger generation in Ukraine. Whereas Putin seems very much in the past, and the younger generation is about communication. It's about talking to each other. It's about finding out why people are doing what they're doing, which should be happening. You know, it's ridiculous. You have to send in columns of troops and weapons and rockets in order to persuade someone that that they should do this. That's not the way to do it. So I think Zelensky has been the hero of the hour, and he's a comedian, but no fool.
Absolutely not. Is it a connection, do you think, that he has able to establish through his comedy, through his performance? It's a connection that he's able to establish with a population that rallies them.
I guess so. I don't know much about his career and how popular his shows were, but I think the great thing is that he has a sense of the absurd, which is very, very important in this sort of situation, because we've seen Putin behaving in a quite a strange way. I mean, to put it mildly, tables about sort of 20 feet long, and generals at the end looking very unsure of what's going on. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's almost near comedy. It's almost an absurd image. What a man sitting alone at the end of a 50-foot table. So I think Zelensky has that feeling of the absurdity of the situation, but also the injustice of the situation. And I think he sees the deeper, darker problems facing Ukraine very, very clearly. So it's not just comedy. But I think that I found, especially when I went to Ukraine, I went to Russia. I mean, they are countries full of laughter and jokes. They're always making sort of jokes, especially in Russia, where you're not meant to make jokes about things. So the terrific underground there, where people are doing very, very strange and wonderful things. And the same with Ukraine. Humour is important, and I think because Zelensky has done shows and has been known as a sort of a humorous actor and all that, that is definitely his connection. People warm to that. Whereas Putin's inscrutability seems to me to be a very, very alienating thing for people.
Did you ever think you'd see something like this in your lifetime?
No. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, because I think throughout my lifetime there have been small wars and there have been, the world crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that, and Suez and various things like that, but they've been contained and on a small scale. The idea of an invasion, for what? To persuade people what? That we are the people you should be with. That's not really the way to change people's minds, by blasting their apartments and killing their children.
Michael Palin, thank you. Michael Palin on the fate of Ukraine and the power of President Zelensky. Well, let's talk now to the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, who joins me. Good morning.
Good morning, Sophie.
Just let's get the latest on the situation in Ukraine, and a lot of focus on that ceasefire that has been announced for the port city of Mariupol. Do you think it will hold?
Look, I'm very sceptical about any assurances or commitments that President Putin makes. Of course, we want to do everything we can. We should exhaust all opportunities to try and provide humanitarian relief, but I think you only have to look at his track record in Syria to see that we need to be very careful to test any assurances Vladimir Putin gives.
There have been talks held in Belarus twice now. Do you think it's pointless to keep holding those talks if he's not going to keep to his word?
Well, I think it's always worth keeping the diplomatic door ajar, but I'm sceptical, at least at this stage, that it's likely to yield a reasonable solution to this. We have seen Putin's initial gambit has stuttered. You can see that with the fierce resistance that they've had in Ukraine. You can see it with the impact of sanctions, which I don't think he was expecting, the ruble falling, the stock market falling to record lows, the impact on interest rates in Russia. But I don't think yet that will have created a kind of change of calculus. We need to keep up that pressure, keep supporting President Zelensky in the heroic defence that the people of Ukraine have put up.
And the images and the stories that we see coming out of Ukraine day after day are horrific. Thousands of people trapped in places like Mariupol, no electricity, no food, no running water. The Russians keep bombarding. Do their tactics change anything about our decision not to intervene?
Well, I think we expected, first of all, if Putin got himself bogged down, that he would respond trying to wrest control of the situation with ever more heavy-handed tactics. Like you, I'm appalled. I was a war crimes lawyer. I've seen a lot of horrific footage, but it never loses its shock factor, and it's appalling. I think the right strategy for us is to keep putting the squeeze on those bankrolling Putin's war machine and keep stealing the capacity as well as the will of the Ukrainian people. So I think that's the right course of action. But anyone thinks this will be resolved in days is deluding themselves. It will take months.
President Putin is so unpredictable. Do you think he could use a nuclear weapon?
I think some of the rhetoric around that has been just that. I think he's trying to take the conversation away from the stuttering initial phase of the campaign. Remember, conscripts going into Ukraine from Russia, very young ones, will have been told they were peacekeepers and clearly faced resistance that they weren't expecting. The Russian people were told the same, that this would be a glorious invasion and retaking ancient Russian lands. That is both false, but also demonstrably disproven that this is in Russia's interest by the impact on their economy that our sanctions have had. But what you do always expect with Putin is that he will try and lash out then. So I'm afraid that is part of his playbook, which is why we need to show strategic stamina and see this through with our international allies.
We hear from President Zelensky day after day, and he is still in Ukraine and still calling for a no-fly zone. He says NATO has given the green light to the bombing of Ukrainian cities and villages by refusing to create that no-fly zone, and everyone who dies will be because of NATO as well, because of NATO's weakness, because of NATO's disunity. If you had to speak to the Ukrainian people, if you spoke to President Zelensky, what would you say?
We understand that cri de coeur, that plight, and that he wants everything done. We've just been clear all along, not just the UK, our allies, the United States, we're not going to engage Putin in direct military confrontation. That is playing and giving succor to his argument that he's actually in a conflict with the West. This is not what this is about. He has invaded a free country. It is illegal. His tactics are brutal and barbaric. And as well as stealing the Ukrainian ability to resist, as well as keeping the financial sanctions so Putin fails, we will also see, and we've seen this week, talk from the International Criminal Court prosecutor, who happens to be a British lawyer. There's a British judge there as well. It's again an institution we've supported, saying that they will look very carefully at war crimes. And our message is we'll support them in that technical assistance. It's an independent court, but there can be no impunity for anything Putin does, or indeed those commanders. So one of the messages, one of the things going through their minds must be, if they get an illegal order to bombard civilians, should they carry it out? Because there's a very real risk they'll end up in prison.
Let me show you some pictures. There are lots. I'm sure you'll have seen it today. The picture of these people here. This is just northwest of Kyiv, about 45-minute drive. I mean, it is extraordinary when you see images like that. These are people trying to flee the Russian bombardment. And when you look at that and all these images that we see day after day, do you not feel that we're letting the people down? They're letting them down in Ukraine.
Oh, and as a war crimes lawyer, previously as a foreign secretary, whenever I see footage of humanitarian disasters, you always challenge yourself, can we do more? But we are doing a huge amount, £220 million of humanitarian assistance on top of the sanctions and all the rest of the things. The extension of the family route for those with the Ukrainian dependents of either Ukrainians here or Brits here, and we'll work with our international partners on all of that. But the best way to stem this flow of refugees and stabilise the crisis as best we can is to do the 2 or 3 things that I mentioned, and the Prime Minister's talked about a 6-point plan. That we cannot allow the situation in Ukraine to become normalised. And also, and you mentioned the diplomacy, we can't allow some deal to be done over the Ukrainian president's head. The Ukrainians must decide their fate. That's why we oppose this invasion. And the same principle must apply to any diplomatic route out.
You talk about President Putin's rhetoric, some of the rhetoric coming out of Russia yesterday. President Putin, and it's all over the papers this morning, saying that the sanctions we've put in place are akin to a declaration of war, although he did add, but thank God it's not come to that. The Foreign Ministry has said that Russia will not forget Britain's role in helping Ukraine. Do you take these as very direct threats to Britain?
Well, I think we were always aware that there'll be repercussions for supporting Ukraine and opposing Vladimir Putin. First of all, though, can I just say, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was illegal. Our sanctions are legal, lawful, and entirely warranted and proportionate and targeted at those bankrolling him. I think we're seeing that rhetoric precisely because the invasion hasn't gone according to plan. He stuttered, he stumbled, he's lashing out. I'm afraid that will have a humanitarian cost, but actually the reality is the cakewalk into Ukraine that Putin told his conscript and the Russian people that they were engaged in has not materialised, and that shows the pressure that he's under. We need to ramp up that pressure, we need to redouble that pressure, certainly not back off.
You've talked about sanctions. We know that you've targeted some oligarchs in this country. What about the Russian businessman, Evgeny Lebedev? His father has links to President Putin, who was ex-KGB. He's here. He is now Lord Lebedev. I spoke to Sir Keir Starmer just a short time ago, and he wants the Intelligence and Security Committee to investigate Lord Lebedev's peerage. Should that be done?
Well, look, first of all, there is a very strict and stringent process when anyone is granted a peerage. I don't know the facts of the case, I wasn't involved in it, but I do know that it was applied very rigorously in this case. And I listened with interest to your conversation when Keir doesn't have any evidence that there's any impropriety. There was none. If there was, he ought to produce it. And again, this was done properly and correctly, and we have procedures and systems in place to make sure it is.
Let's talk about nuclear. We've already spoken about nuclear weapons being deployed, but what about the threat to the whole of Europe from a nuclear power plant disaster in Ukraine? We've already seen one come under attack. There are 3 more in Ukraine.
Reckless, totally reprehensible. Not just that Putin attacked that plant, but also that when the Ukrainian emergency services went to put out the fire, the bombardment continued. And that is why, obviously, I should say that the IAEA, the international body that looks at nuclear issues, civilian nuclear issues, has been very clear that they don't see any evidence of contamination. So the site is, we understand, on the best evidence we've got, secure. But absolutely, it shows the need to redouble our support for the Ukrainian people, but also to reinforce our NATO allies. And that is one of the 6 points that the Prime Minister, writing in the New York Times, set out. We also need to bear in mind the European neighbours in NATO on that periphery, and whether it's maritime, whether it's air policing, or whether it's troops through the enhanced forward presence, we're strengthening our resilience in NATO.
We're seeing pictures of people flooding out of Ukraine. It's closing in on 1.5 million people who have already left, and that's just in 11 days. The French Interior Minister has called the UK lacking in humanity because they say that we turned our back on 150 refugees at Calais because no valid visas were in their position. Can't they just come in?
Look, if we just opened the door, not only will we not benefit the people that we need to, the genuine refugees, but I think we'd undermine the popular support for this. I don't think that's the right thing to do. We need to make sure that we're acting for those that need our support. We've extended the family dependence route. We think that will be around up to 200,000 people that will be able to come here. We will.
That's not going to be enough,
well,
though, is it?
Sorry, but that's the first bit. The second bit is the humanitarian route. That is uncapped, so we'll work with the United Nations and other agencies, but also individuals, business, charitable sponsors here. And that route for Ukrainians fleeing persecution is uncapped. And of course, we've provided £220 million of humanitarian support, which is directly for the Ukrainian people, but also for those countries taking refugees. I think it's right. I mean, if you look at the history of the UK, I'm the son of a refugee myself, but if you look recently, we took in British overseas national BNOs from Hong Kong, from Afghanistan. I think we have shown we will step up to the plate, and we're doing so in Ukraine. Of course, you find this with conflict situations. Most people want to go, either stay in their country of birth and origin, or go to a country nearby so they can return later. And I think we can expect that with Ukraine.
And a lot of people are putting forward, making a lot of effort for people who are to help people in Ukraine. I just want to show you what happened last night, though. The Chelsea fans, during a moment, a tribute at Ukraine at Burnley last night. Let me just show you now. So this is the moment of pausing for thought for Ukraine, applause for Ukraine, but very quickly it is broken into by Chelsea fans chanting Roman Abramovich's name. Do you think that's acceptable?
No, I'm a Chelsea fan. I think it's totally wrong. It will be a minority of fans doing it, and I thought Thomas Tuchel, the manager, was quite right to come out and be clear about his disagreement with that.
OK, Dominic Raab, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Well, thank you to all my guests, and thank you for joining me. We will be back here next Sunday morning. I hope you can join me then. Goodbye.